We can split up if you want, but I want to live with our son. After scolding me a lot, John seemed pleased. He took a deep breath while I thought about how to respond. Our son, who'd been waiting in the background, stepped forward. "If you don't know, Dad, let me tell you. That person is..." Pointing at his father's mistress, our son said. His words made me break into a cheeky smile. "My name is Jennifer. I turned 42 this year and I work as a freelance illustrator. I've been married for 15 years and we have an 8th grade son. Throughout our marriage, John has struggled to keep a job, so we mostly rely on my income. Balancing housework, raising our child, and my job has been challenging. I had to work from home because John often took sporadic short-term jobs, making it hard for me to leave our child behind for work. Starting as a newbie and freelancing was tough, but now I have a stable income and consistent work. Thanks to referrals, I've landed projects illustrating educational magazines and brochures. Now that our son is older and more independent, I not only work from home, but also go out for work a few times a week. Despite the challenges, the three of us live together harmoniously. However, something has been bothering me about John. Despite my steady income, he doesn't seem eager to find a new job and has been quite aimless. He rarely works full-time and doesn't contribute much to housework or raising our child. He doesn't show much interest in our son, who is now in his challenging teenage years. Although David may seem distant, he helps with chores when I'm not looking. While David has grown, John doesn't seem to have matured. He often comes home late, and I've become suspicious and frustrated. Even on days when he's not scheduled to work, he claims he has to go for work reasons. There are other things that make me suspicious. In the past few months, John hasn't been taking care of David much, but suddenly started picking him up and dropping him off at his basketball club. This is unusual because, given the changes of today's world, our household rule is for parents to always drop off and pick up. I've always been the one doing it, but lately, John has been taking on this responsibility without any apparent reason. I really appreciate your help with picking up and dropping off, but something felt strange. I realized my suspicion when I passed by the place David goes. I decided to take a different route home after shopping. In front of the place, I saw John, who wasn't supposed to be there. He said he'd be late because of work out of town tonight. John was happily chatting with a woman who looked like one of the staff from the basketball facility. I had a bad feeling. As I stared at them, the woman noticed me and asked, "Are you David's mom?" I said yes, feeling awkward. Although I had seen her during drop-offs and pickups, I didn't remember all the staff faces. I wondered what duty she had there. Ignoring my husband, who looked rigid, I made small talk with her. The woman introduced herself as Jessica. It's usual to introduce oneself with not only a name but also what they do for the child in these situations. Noticing my puzzled expressions, my husband seemed to hurry to end their conversation. On the way home, we didn't speak, and it felt like he was avoiding me, even though he enjoyed talking to Jessica so much. Walking beside me, he avoided eye contact. I could tell something was up. His late returns, eagerness for drop-offs and pickups, and strange behavior after being spotted made me believe Jessica had something to do with it. Was he having an affair with that slightly younger woman? Somewhere in my heart, I knew I had sensed a change ever since he started doing the drop-offs and pickups. He'd become noticeably distant from me. That day, when our son returned from basketball club, I casually inquired about his father's behavior. The only response I got was a curt, "I don't know." It seems my son was annoyed about his dad wanting to drive him every day. Chasing after our reluctant son just didn't seem right. I've been casting suspicious glances at him for some time. Those suspicions were going to be proven right soon enough. I was just passing by, so I thought I'd drop in. "David, how are you feeling?" "Thank you for coming all this way," Jessica said. "Now, please have some coffee." Jessica, who I had not suspected of being my husband's mistress, began finding excuses to visit our home more and more. She would mention our son, but it seemed like a pretext. She always appeared during the hours my husband was home, not me or my son. Watching them conversing cheerfully in the living room, I was sure of John's infidelity. A month after I began noticing odd behavior, he started coming home later and leaving for a few days at a time. I asked him what he was up to, pointing out his late-night return. Jokingly, I said, "At least spare me the cheating." He suddenly stood up and glared at me. "You just stick to your work. I'm taking care of David, so don't pry into it unnecessarily." Whether it was the way I asked or something else, he seemed irritated and left the living room with a sigh. I was really mad, to be told, as if he was doing everything when he left all the housework and David to me. "What's the matter, Mom?" David, who had been watching our little fight, spoke up unusually. "Oh, it's nothing. What about you, David? Why are you up at this hour?" David stared at me before slowly opening his mouth. Hesitantly, he told me about a female staff he thought might be his father's mistress. According to David, Jessica would cling to him a lot at the facility. David found it annoying and would ignore her, but he was frustrated that she would come to our house. I disliked it too, so it was obvious that my son would be annoyed by someone from his basketball club imposing on our home. I was relieved to know that I wasn't the only one who disliked it, but the problem was far from solved. When I returned home from a meeting, I could hear joyful conversation from the living room. It was John and Jessica. David was probably in his room, as there was no sign of him joining in the conversation. When I opened the door, both of them turned their eyes to me. John looked uncomfortable, but Jessica smiled at me confidently. "Welcome back, David's mom." I ran into John, so he invited me in. Somewhere along the line, Jessica started addressing my husband by his name, and I had a deep unease about it. "We meet often, don't we? Isn't it a busy time for you at work?" I asked with a hint of sarcasm. She replied, "Well, this is part of my job." I felt like yelling at her for making herself at home so boldly. "It's just that this house feels cozy. It looks like you don't clean it thoroughly, but in a good way, you know?" Jessica pointed out the deficiencies in my housekeeping with a sly grin. My husband didn't rebut, but instead seemed to side with Jessica, chuckling along. Even though I work from home, I am somewhat self-conscious about not keeping up with housework. If he'd been more proactive in helping with chores and childcare, it wouldn't be an issue. I couldn't understand why I was the only one being mocked and ridiculed. Unable to bear the tension in the room, I hastily left the living room for the bedroom, still holding my stuff. I felt really upset, sad, and embarrassed. I was scared that Jessica might replace me in the family if she wasn't linked to my son's basketball team. I might have argued back, but I worried how it would affect my son. Even after that, my husband and Jessica continued their dates, showing off their relationship in front of me. I'd heard from others that they often met outside, pretending to discuss my son's education. I decided to gather proof during my husband's absences, and I found a lot of evidence of his unfaithfulness. Despite claiming we couldn't afford gifts, I discovered receipts for motels, fancy restaurants, and expensive watches and jewelry in his coat pocket. I even found receipts from places he said we couldn't afford to go. It hurt to think he'd go with his mistress, but not his wife. Still, I kept my composure and continued collecting evidence. The idea of divorce crossed my mind, but I wanted to hang in there until David graduated from high school. However, I vowed to gather as much evidence as possible for a better position if the time came. I wondered where all the money he spent on his mistress came from. Even if he put in all his salary, it would hard to keep up the charade. While thinking deeply around the house, I suddenly remembered something and went pale. In our house, there was an account for my son's college fund. I had a bad feeling and cold sweat ran down my back. I checked the account transactions and found evidence of substantial amounts being withdrawn several times over the past few months. I had created this savings account specifically for my son's education fund. I hadn't checked in a while and was shocked to find that the balance had decreased significantly. I had managed our credit card usage and monthly bills carefully, but I hadn't checked his savings account monthly. This realization hit me hard, and I began to tremble. I tried hard to steady my shaking hands. The money he spent on his affair came from the savings I had put aside for our son. I didn't even care who he was having an affair with anymore. What I couldn't forgive was that he was using the money saved for our child's future for his own selfish needs. His betrayal against me as his wife wasn't as hurtful as the betrayal against our own son. I swallowed my boiling anger and decided to act like everything was normal. I didn't want our son, who's at such an impressionable age, to catch on. I chose to keep all the problems and worries to myself, trying not to burden our son, who's been studying so hard. But the stress took a toll on me, and I started making small mistakes in my household chores and even at work, even with Mrs. Smith, a client. I've known Mrs. Smith for a long time, and she noticed I've been feeling down. She said, "Jennifer, you seem off lately. Don't overdo it at work. If anything's bothering you, let me know any time." I felt kind of pathetic for making her worry, but her words gave me some comfort. While I was struggling, my husband seemed to be having a great time with his mistress more than ever. Without my interference, he seemed more relaxed. Sooner or later, our son David would face the problems surrounding our family. David noticed I was feeling low and suddenly approached me to help fold the laundry. He said, "I know what's going on. Do whatever you want to do, Mom. You don't have to worry about me." He took the folded laundry to the dresser. He's not much of a talker, but his thoughtful actions warmed my heart. It made me angrier at the traitor who touched the money I had saved for our son. There needed to be some sort of retribution for the traitor. First, I wondered if I should reach out to that person who told me they'd always be there to support me. I clenched my fist tightly and swore vengeance on my husband and his mistress. One evening, my husband suddenly told me he'd be away for almost a week due to work, He claimed it was a training program in another state, but I doubted that's the truth. The restaurant chain he worked for only operated within our state and didn't have any locations or offices outside. When he took the job, he boasted that one of the perks was not having to relocate out of state. When my son and I heard the story, we responded, but deep down we were both highly critical of John. My son casually said to my husband, "You know, I heard one of the staff from the club going to be off work for a week too. I don't know if she's going on vacation, but that seems pretty unusual. I mean, it'd be tough to go on a week-long vacation unless you've got some cash." As we conversed in a nonchalant tone, my husband looked at us with a startled expression. Until then, he had been proudly talking about the intensity of the training he was going to attend, but he suddenly became silent and stared down. Glancing at him, I noticed he was anxiously looking at his smartphone. Ever since I became sure of my husband's infidelity, I've been keeping tabs on both him and Jessica. I even hired a private investigator who informed me that Jessica, who's working at the basketball facility, is also taking a week off. I've known all along that my husband's business trip was just a cover for a romantic getaway. I could have caught him red-handed, but I had other plans. I've been planning something ever since I knew about my husband's intentions to travel with Jessica. Of course, I had no intention of proceeding without my son's consent, but now he was on board. On the day of their trip, I said goodbye to my excited husband and then my son, and I started cleaning the house. Some relatives came over to help clean, and we also began packing. Our plan was to move out while my husband was away and stay somewhere else until we found a new home. We were going to stay with some relatives for a bit. When they heard about our situation, they were angry at my husband's actions, but concerned for David. They gladly offered us a room. I made sure my husband couldn't access our savings account by transferring all the remaining money to my personal account. While making preparations, I noticed my husband's belongings were left behind. I couldn't leave his stuff behind when vacating the house. After some thought, I decided to send his belongings to a particular place. After getting Mrs. Smith's consent, I handed over the boxes to the pickup service. Looking around my tidy house, my son and I shared a smile. A few days after we moved, my phone rang suddenly. Seeing the caller's name made me sigh involuntarily.
Hello, Jennifer.
Hey, what's up in the middle of the day?
Actually, during my training, I ran out of money. Can you transfer a bit to my account?
My husband, who called in a panic, was obviously lying and begging me for money. No wonder our savings account was empty. He couldn't withdraw any funds. He must have really been in a bind since he sounded much more desperate than usual. Was it because he didn't want to look bad in front of Jessica? I was utterly exasperated. When I declined, he almost sounded like he was about to cry. With a smirk, I said, "Why don't you just use the account you always withdraw from? Isn't there still a lot left?" After a moment of silence, he started yelling and said, "Are you okay with me being broke?" But I didn't indulge him. Instead, I goaded him further. "Your training's going to end soon anyways. You'll be fine even without money." Suddenly in the background, the frantic voice of a woman could be heard. "That's right. I'd been waiting for this moment." Taken aback by Jessica's voice in the background, my husband hastily hung up. Now everything was in place. The next day, my son and I headed to a specific location, a magnificent mansion with a well-maintained garden. Anyone could tell that the residents were wealthy. On cue, my son and I found my cheating husband and his mistress in a room. My terrified husband sat on the floor, apologizing to someone. That someone with a stern look on her face was Mrs. Smith, a longtime client of mine and currently the principal of a middle school David goes to. David, my son, goes to her school, and Mrs. Smith and I have built a close relationship over the years. We trust each other with personal troubles. "I'm really sorry for my trouble," I said. Mrs. Smith replied, "I should be the one apologizing. Because of my good-for-nothing daughter, all of this happened." It turned out Jessica, who was on a trip with my husband, was grilled by her parents for a package she received at home and had no choice but to return home immediately. Naturally, she told my husband John to come with her. Upon hearing Mrs. Smith's words, my husband started to shake in fear. Mrs. Smith had always been concerned about my deteriorating health after knowing about John's affair. I told Mrs. Smith about the affair, and when she found out her daughter was the mistress, she was really, really upset. But Mrs. Smith wanted to make things right for her daughter's actions. She apologized to me and scolded her daughter sternly, saying she should be ashamed of always wanting what isn't hers. Mrs. Smith cooperated with me, and even though she was angry at her daughter, she wouldn't forgive her actions. Jessica, the daughter, tried to defend herself, saying it was a misunderstanding. But I knew it wasn't. Mrs. Smith, being strict and having a strong moral code, wouldn't tolerate dishonest behavior. Jessica didn't want her mom to know about the affair, but now it was out in the open. I didn't feel sorry for Jessica. Mrs. Smith insisted on an apology and said she would make her daughter pay for her mistakes. Even though Jessica was panicking, I ignored her and focused on my husband, who suddenly started berating me with hurtful words. My son, David, stepped forward, defending me and telling Jessica off for her actions. My husband seemed satisfied with himself, taking a deep breath after berating me. But David behind me spoke up, revealing that Jessica wasn't a regular staff at the club, but just an intern. He warned her not to get chummy with him again and criticized her for flirting with men, which disgusted him. It turned out Jessica hadn't been officially hired at the club, and my husband, who believed she was experienced, was wrong. Looking at Jessica's shocked face, I decided to give her some advice before leaving. I exposed that I paid for everything: rent, living expenses, and David's tuition fees. My husband had been working odd job for years, hiding the fact that I was the one supporting the family. Mrs. Smith was devastated by the reality of her daughter's actions and faced the harsh truth. After David and I left happily, my husband, Jessica, and a load of stuff were kicked out of Mrs. Smith's house. Months passed since our move, and thanks to Mrs. Smith's advice, I hired a lawyer to handle the divorce smoothly. I heard that the savings I set aside for David's education could be claimed as child support. Jessica, on the other hand, faced rumors at the basketball club and lost her job. She sought help from her parents, but Mrs. Smith didn't want to assist her. Now, cut her off from her family, Jessica is lost and confused, despising a man without money. My husband keeps trying to reconcile, but neither David nor I want that. Mrs. Smith feels guilty for her daughter ruining a family. I'm grateful for the principal, and thanks to her, I have a new job and life with just David and me. It's filled me with hope. David appreciates the job I do as a mom, and I'm proud of being his mom. I want to keep pursuing my career as an illustrator and work even harder for my precious David.